Welcome to IFAB Online.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora everyone, welcome to IFAB Online.
Greetings from San Diego, California, on the west coast of the United States. My name is Stuart Krantz, President of International Fundraising Services at Chapel in York. I'm joined today by Daniel McDiarmid, Principal Consultant of Ask Right, based in Brisbane, Australia. Daniel, why don't you introduce yourself today?
Thanks, Stuart. Great to be with everyone, all the participants of IFAB Online. As a little introduction, I led advancement in 3 Australian universities over my career, and for the last 15 years have been an advisor to universities, mostly in Australia and New Zealand. I spend about half my time in New Zealand, or I did until March at least. The leadership of the advancement offices involved a lot of fundraising in Asia and some in the UK and North America. So it's great to be here on this international topic with you, Stuart.
Terrific. Thanks, Daniel. Just a little background about myself. I joined Chapel in York as President of International Fundraising Services a little over a year ago. Before that, spent around 2 decades in executive roles at Harvard and MIT, Scripps Oceanography, and UC San Diego. It's terrific to be here for this important session that we've titled today, Fundraising for Education in a Global World, 8 Considerations in the Year 2020. And my, oh my, this has been quite a year for all of us, of course, and there's much to consider for educational institutions around the world during and preparing for hopefully the end of the pandemic. And it's clearly the idea of boiling it down to 8 considerations seems like to most of us probably a futile exercise. But that said, what I think Daniel and I seek to do here is not to provide answers for every concern that we all have at this time, but rather pose some important matters worth exploring as fundraisers in the field, and hopefully use those matters and those issues to enlighten us and maybe come up with some creative solutions going forward. So we hope that today what is shared can be relevant regardless of the size or stage of your international fundraising effort. We realize that there's a lot of folks who will be listening in from different types of organizations, different types of academic institutions, but we do hope that the issues that we all focus on today will help in all of our outreach and engagement. So Daniel, welcome. Before focusing on the considerations, we really felt that it would be good to start our discussion by posing some questions that we can reflect on throughout our talk. And we hope by the end of our discussion today, we'll revisit the questions and we'll see if we have some answers or some things that might sort of reflect on what we're discussing today. So Daniel, would you be willing to share some of these right now?
Thanks, Stuart. I like to consider things from the fundamentals, and I think there are a few fundamentals that all of us should challenge ourselves with at the moment. And the first is, has any of the true basics of fundraising actually changed? Are the sound principles that have guided fundraising over recent years, are they still the ones that we take forward? Or is there any reason to doubt the fundamentals? And the second is, what changes do we need to make to our practice in order to be effective during the rest of the COVID period for however long that might be? And the third thing is really jumping beyond that. Is it possible to use the experience of these times to actually make significant improvements in our fundraising going forward?
Yeah, great questions, Daniel. Thanks. And this kind of leads us into our first consideration today, and that is the idea of how what's happening this year might affect or impact our development of our cases for support, for philanthropic support, and our fundraising action plans focusing on our international markets and our international prospect and donor pools. In order for us to sort of explore this further, this consideration, it might be worth hearing a few quotes regarding higher education that reflects what's happening in our current environment. Mark Andreessen, an entrepreneur, investor, many of us have heard of Mark over the years. he really argues that this is a time to build during these kind of challenging opportunities. In a recent article, he explained that every Western institution was unprepared for the coronavirus pandemic, despite many prior warnings. And this is in many ways a failure of action. And as a follow-up, one university president recently stated that everyone is calling for expenses to be cut deeply. And he believes this shock is actually the catalyst we all needed right now to rethink how we deliver education of the greatest value to students and society in general. And I think we bring up these quotes primarily for fundraisers and for advancement folks to help and to be part of the solution in rethinking what might resonate with our donors and with our prospects going forward. So this may mean turning the status quo a little bit on its head. If enrollment and funding declines as many predict going forward, leaders in higher education may find themselves in the impossible but inescapable position of having to change their existing programs and shift them to be more responsive to the needs and also to deal with budget issues. Daniel?
One of the things that is really hard, I think, for advancement professionals to grapple with is the reduction in their staff. As university revenues are significantly and negatively impacted by the inability of people to travel, and particularly of international students to come to country, university finances are in decline. Universities, certainly where I am in Australia, are cutting back on staff numbers by the hundreds in every university, including reducing the number of fundraisers. And the challenge about that is it just doesn't follow logic. If people are actually raising money, why would you reduce the number of people raising money when the university is hurting financially? But there's an argument, I guess, for sharing the pain or something, but it's not strictly logical. But there we are, and it just throws up the challenge because the advancement officers need to meet the current challenges, in many cases, with fewer people.
And in many ways, as a follow-up to that, colleges and universities must accept ways of doing things that are going to disrupt sort of the current products of higher education. These might be programs, activities, initiatives that in the past generated a significant portion of revenue and income. And as a result, we're really talking about things like gleaming student centers, classrooms, auditoriums, study abroad programs, and yes, certainly in the United States, things like football and basketball arenas. So the college experience might shift. And we bring this up as a precursor to really talk about this consideration as it relates to our work as fundraisers and in the fundraising world. What will be taken away? What will be added? How will this college experience evolve? And how will this affect what our cases are for private support going forward? There was a quote recently, which I thought was pretty interesting and worth sharing, which is really the pandemic has given us one of the biggest global challenges since World War II. And the question I think many university leaders are going to be confronting is, what did they do during this time? And this is probably going to be asked after the pandemic is over. And we believe this will apply to colleges and universities and advancement leadership. What did they do during this time that really set them up to succeed going forward in terms of their engagement with their alumni and with others? So with these powerful message sort of as a backdrop, Daniel, maybe you can share some thoughts on how academic institutions that you're engaging with are sort of thinking about their existing cases for support and their international fundraising action plans going forward, and what changes seem to be taking place in 2020 right now.
I think there are some great opportunities for universities to consider where they are in the world. Before the pandemic and continuing through it, universities position themselves in one or two ways. Either we're a great institution and your financial support can make us even greater, but you might have noticed in the previous 4 or 5 years, there were some institutions who moved their message to, We're here to help the complex problems we face in the world. And if you think about those two alternatives, we're great or we're here to help, which of those things do you think is going to be most relevant this year, next year, and for the next 10 years? I think it's the latter, and it's the institutions who position themselves as a help to the world rather than wanting people to help them be better. They'll be better positioned. What we've seen over the last 7 or 8 months is a spontaneous giving by people to many institutions, particularly to support health initiatives or to support students in need. And a lot of it has just come out of reliable supporters recognising the universities will face challenges. Some has come as a result of appeals that have been run, but I think this support may not be sustainable in the long term, and it's increasingly important for institutions now to get their case together, to substantiate why they deserve support during this period, to talk about how they've adapted during the changing conditions and what they're going to do to help defeat or adapt to COVID-19.
That leads us right into what Daniel and I were thinking of, making sure that there was some action points that we could generate out of some of the issues that we're talking about today, some of the considerations. And this one is worth noting that it's critical, I think, as development professionals, as advancement professionals, that there's a review of cases for your cases for support, all universities' cases for support, and ensure they address the concerns that are of importance to prospects, donors, supporters, board members right now. So that leads us into consideration number 2, which we titled as, the importance of cultural understandings as academic institutions and educational institutions do international fundraising, perform it, plan it, etc. Daniel, I wondered if you could share with us some of your insights into the importance of this consideration. It's clearly was something you and I spoke about a lot in preparing for this. And as secondly, along the same vein, I wonder if you could share some thoughts on the elements of cultural competency and the importance of cultural competency among development officers charged with doing fundraising. And what you think, thirdly, is critical in terms of being required of development officers to be successful in this landscape with a focus on cultural competency issues.
I think, as you and I have discussed over the years, one of the great things about doing international fundraising is you become more aware of some of the cultural mores and of how you need to present. But those lessons usually are also applicable at home, and you become a much better domestic fundraiser if you're also working internationally. And I think whether it's domestically or internationally, the single greatest attribute of any fundraiser is the ability to see life from the donor's perspective. The difference about doing international work is that there are more differences between perhaps that perspective and your normal one. So it takes a bit more effort, a bit more understanding in order to see life from the donor's perspective. We could fill this whole hour talking about the cultural gaffes we've heard of. We could probably fill most of the hour in cultural gaffes we've been part of. But I'll give you just a very simple one to show how things can go awry. I was in an audience at a conference when a very senior North American university figure appeared on conference stage with the eminent, well-respected leader of an Asian university. It was a large audience, including many of that university's staff. And the American university leader, being a very affable person, at one point put his hand on the shoulder of the Asian leader and called him by his first name. The place went silent, and then great drawing in of breath. These two friendly gestures were meant to emphasize friendliness and equanimity, but they just came across as perhaps disrespectful, and certainly they diminished the standing of the visitor in the eyes of the audience. No offense intended, perhaps none taken, but an audience left shaken. So the challenge we often read about in handy tips and textbooks and so forth, some of the obvious things about time zones, language, getting names and titles. I've got books on my shelf about how to get names and titles right. But the more important point are some of the assumptions you make that you probably shouldn't. And I've got just a short list. One is that even if you speak the same language, you presume that words have the same meaning, and they don't always. People presume that others will be so impressed that you're providing the opportunity for them to meet your president that they'll adjust their schedule to do so. They might, but they won't like it. Interesting presumption that everyone uses the same size paper. I once had to ship paper to San Francisco because Hong Kong insists on legal documents being on A4, and no one in the university office in San Francisco had any A4 or knew where to buy it. So a small but really important cultural fact. The attitude to electronic communications is not universal. Some cultures are still very paper-based, and your email doesn't carry the same weight. The presumption that because people have agreed to something that they actually want to do it is not always correct. And even electronic communications such as Zoom aren't used by everyone in the same way. But the great advantage to those who work in a comprehensive university is that there's a very good chance that you have experts on staff, experts in the countries and cultures of the places where you want to do business. So use them. Break down the barrier that they're academic and I'm advancement staff, they won't necessarily help me. Hopefully they will be pleased to participate and to assist you. You've probably got an international office of people who travel, or at least used to travel frequently to the country where your prospects are. And you've certainly got alumni in those countries. So use them, learn from them, test things with them so that you can get everything right. Don't rely on conference presentations or books. Make use of the human resources. And a really important point, and it applies to a gift solicitation everywhere and other important meetings, don't just meet to talk about them and prepare for them, actually rehearse them. I'm a great believer in rehearsal. I've seen huge gift solicitations and other important meetings saved because people rehearse. And when there's cultural differences involved, try to rehearse with someone present who can critique how you've handled the differences.
Great wisdom there, Daniel, and backed up by many experiences that I've personally had over the years. And as a result, I think our next action point with regards to cultural competency and cultural sensitivity is ensure your activities, including your online activities, are culturally appropriate by rehearsal and critique. Nothing beats preparing for important discussions with alumni and supporters. Let's move on to consideration number 3, which is specifically related to what we're all dealing with today, this year, which is the pandemic and COVID-19. Consideration number 3 that Daniel and I explore is cultivation and solicitation strategies that are reflective of what's happening this year. Let's discuss a little bit about the shift that has occurred due to the pandemic. Historically, data illustrated that institutions which visited prospects early and often raised more than those that did not. And that's in many ways the challenge in some ways with doing international fundraising. But this notion of really being in contact more frequently, having the kinds of sensitive touches will lead to more gifts and larger gifts. When the type of outreach that was conducted was then, of course, still is critically important. In-person methods worked, and they do work, as we all know, and the results support that conclusion. But Daniel, I wonder if you could share some thoughts on what has been happening since travel has sort of grounded to a halt. And this whole question we have in a lot of ways is, how do we define success now? And what can we learn moving forward, given the current realities?
There are certainly changes. There are changes in the way we contact people and their availability. Remember, the whole world traveling less, people are more available before. The times to get meetings with busy people have been reduced, which is a great blessing to us all. The way we work through intermediaries has changed as well, particularly in Asia and some parts of the Middle East, where intermediaries are much used. You've got a different dynamic because you've got electronic communications, firstly with the intermediary, and then with the main person or group of people that you wish to talk to. This crisis is a little bit like others in that you recall that crisis advisors, people who advise in crisis management, always make one point when they come to help your organization out. And that point is that in the long term, people won't remember the crisis so much as how you handled it. So how you handle it is critical. Now, I think this is different because no one's ever going to forget COVID-19. It will be reflecting on this probably for the rest of our lives. So no one's going to forget it, but they will still remember how your institution dealt with it. And so it's very important, both how you deal with it and the messages you send out about how you deal with it. But for advancement professionals, we often come back, and we should, to how does it affect individuals? Remember, large-scale fundraising is the one-size-fits-one plan. And you really need to think about that. I mentioned before, the key characteristic is seeing the world from the donor's perspective. And during this time when solicitation techniques and meeting engagement might be changing, you do this exercise. Imagine yourself sitting in the chair where your donor sits. If you've visited them, imagine the room, imagine you're sitting, and imagine that you're reflecting on what your experience with the university has been like over the last 6 months. Did somebody contact you? When they did they ask how you were? Did they ask how your family was faring, how your business was going? Did they seem interested in how your country was getting through the pandemic? If the institution's a comprehensive major institution with lots of resources and great expertise, did they offer to help me in any way? Did they update me on the project I'm already funding? Did they tell me that what the delays or the problems were, which I'm probably hearing about from others anyway, but did they own up to them? Did they seek my advice on anything? I'm working my own way through the pandemic, through my businesses and family, etc. I've learned things and I've got things to share. Was the university interested in learning from me? Or did they just keep asking for money? Did they offer to do online meetings, or did they just cancel meetings? And I'll talk more about this perhaps later. Did they send me a little video to show me what was happening on campus and how quiet it is now, or what people are doing? Having done that for your number one donor, you do it for number two, you do it for number three. And for each one, you come up with action points about what you need to do. And if you're doing that, if you've been doing that exercise, how have you scored? Of course, this is really difficult if you're trying to cope with everything else and you're in one of those development offices that have been downsized because of the financial restrictions on the university.
Yes, well, you bring up a great point right at the end, which is how do you fit this important preparation into sort of your action plans and your annual planning process? And it sort of reflects on the third point that we would like to share, which is always a good practice, but it's so critical given what's happening now with the pandemic and with reduced resources and greater sensitivity to how one interacts with folks around the world. The critical nature of having individual engagement plans for all of your major donors and prospects and supporters. And make sure you think carefully that it's effective, segmented communications, not one size fits all, obviously, especially in different parts of the world. Be sensitive to that, as I'm sure all of you are thinking about in that way. Our consideration number 4 involves the importance of volunteer engagement at this time. Daniel, it would appear that international fundraising for education would benefit tremendously at this time from volunteers and other stakeholders around the world. I wondered if you could share some of your thoughts around engagement with volunteers during this year and obviously leading into 2021, and some considerations to keep in mind at this time.
I think most universities do a good job of keeping people informed. We've got good channels, and universities fortunately had developed online communities and use of social media and of electronic communications for most of their volunteers before this. So most universities and higher education institutions were well placed to do that. And what we've seen over the last 15 years in terms of both alumni and volunteer engagement is a lot of stress on the relationship, ensuring that there are good points of contact, people well managed, in some cases sort of individualized plans for that, very much stressing the person-to-person relationship. But about 6 or 7 years ago, there started to come out some good research about the importance of place to people. It's not just about people-to-people contact, it's also about campus and place. And from the Australian university's perspective, where we have lots of offshore students who study a credential through our institutions but never come to the campus or to the country, it was always interesting to see at our offshore graduations how interested people were in photos of the campus or videos of campus life. In a place they'd never been and probably might never get to, they were intensely interested in what campus looked like and what was happening, etc. So remember, relationships, whether they're with alumni or volunteers, are about relationships primarily, but also about place. So these days, of course, people can't travel to your campus, but it doesn't mean they're not interested in your campus. You can take little videos, and they don't have to be super professional. You can walk around with your iPhone, your camera, and take a short video. You know, are the ducks back on the lake? Is the refectory deserted? Is the library operating? Perhaps it's not. Perhaps it's full queuing with students. Show people what your campus looks like today. We've probably all become very proficient at virtual events and meetings. But one of the things to think about is some people like it this way. Some people won't want to be coming back to your on-campus meetings. They don't want the flight, they don't want the commute, they don't want the parking hassle. And I think the thing we really need to be alert to is what of the changed COVID behavior is going to stay with us. And I think one of the things that is very likely to stay is that the virtual, what's now a requirement, has to stay an option for nearly everything, for meetings, for events, for conferences such as this one, that it doesn't just go back to in-person. I think we're going to go back to almost everything being both in-person and offering virtual attendance. People have found it very comfortable, sometimes very efficient, and there are lots of people who are saying they prefer it. So you need then to prepare for your volunteers to meet by video technology. And the third question we raised at the start was, can you use the lessons of COVID-19 to jump ahead and to find some improvement for the institution? And there's one I would like you to consider. Some institutions pre-COVID and for many years pre-COVID had invested in international councils of advisors. You saw places like INSEAD in France, the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton, and others had established these these councils filled with very eminent, successful, usually wealthy and generous people who gathered on campus, usually once a year for 2 or 3 days, listened to the institution's update and provided advice. And as I say, it's not coincidental that these were very generous funders. Many institutions didn't do this because they are very resource intensive. You're dealing with 20 perhaps highly influential people. That takes a lot of managing. But there is an opportunity now in the changed times for you to begin an international council of advisors that only ever meets virtually, where you have no presumption that they'll ever come on campus as a group or gathering. So if you can imagine setting up a 1 day a year international council of advisors meeting where they hear about the institution, offer their advice, deal with each other virtually, it becomes very efficient. It still has the great benefits for your campus that you have this very capable people who are honored to be part of your international council and often back that up, that valued association with your eminent institution, back it up with financial support. So hopefully that's one of these fundamental changes that COVID might bring to our institutions.
Thanks, Daniel. That's really interesting. And what's so interesting about it is it's sort of taking advantage or trying to find the lemonade a little bit in the lemons of what's happening this year and come up with effective solutions for identifying, cultivating, soliciting, and stewarding supporters going forward. So the fourth takeaway in this one, action step, is really be ready for online participation to stay permanent in some elements and be open to increasing involvement of international volunteers now that travel has been eliminated as a requirement of participation. But be creative about it, be culturally sensitive, going back to the other, one of the other considerations, and prepare and plan on how to make it just exceptional in all ways. Consideration 5 is really around engaging senior leadership during this time. While we've always known that utilizing senior leadership is a critical element within our international development work, and of course our national development work too, the pandemic in many ways has forced us to try to think even more creatively on how best to utilize leadership in our outreach and our engagement efforts. Travel is really out of the question for so many of us, but what is not out of the question for us right now is the value that leadership, both academics, research leadership, as well as administrative leadership, can have in all of our engagement efforts. I mean, in actuality, there are excellent and creative approaches to utilize leadership and bring the campus closer to prospects and donors, alumni around the world. Daniel was mentioning a few of them in his earlier comments. I've spoken with a whole slew of fundraisers lately from around the world, and each has shared various examples: wine and cheese stewardship virtual events, multi-generational family scholar presentations, virtual award presentations presented by the Vice Chancellor, and on. There's a lot of creative approaches, but I think the most important thing to keep in mind with all of these interesting examples is there was careful thought about how to put them into place and roll them out. It wasn't done ad hoc. It was all focused with sensitivity to either the family that you're focusing on doing outreach with, how the senior leadership was prepared effectively for this to put on the best face and the best representation of the university or the college or the other academic institution, and all with the ultimate objective to achieve some desired cultivation or solicitation goal going forward. There's tremendous opportunities to share campus updates in all of these opportunities. And you can do it for larger numbers of people. So a key action step with senior leadership is really to make sure to prepare leadership well in advance for online prospect and donor engagements. There's also been some horror stories I've heard as well in terms of what was said, how it was shared online. So it's really important to prepare effectively for this. Make virtual experiences authentic and honest, but also interesting and uplifting, to give the sense that who are on the other line a sense of the excitement, enthusiasm of what's happening on campus. But to be authentic too about the impact and influence of how the pandemic is altering the framework of what's happening on campus. Communication should be authentic rather than highly curated and overly distilled. So make it real. So consideration number 6, that was 5, is really focused on understanding donor interests in a global context. It's really focusing in on what they might be interested in at this time, supporters going forward. And I'm wondering, Daniel, if you would be willing to share some thoughts of what you're hearing on how the pandemic may be shifting a little bit of what alums and donors are interested in at this time, and how it might be affecting philanthropy more globally.
I think we should take advantage of the research that has been going on, not just during the COVID pandemic, but in the lead up to it. Places like the Giving USA report seem somewhat irrelevant this year, except that they tell us where philanthropy was going before this struck, and might have hints as to how it will return. So, but in most places where philanthropy is well studied, there are 2 important trends that have been standing out over the last few years and continue through this year. And one is that the proportion of the population making charitable gifts is actually declining. This seems really strange when everyone who runs an acquisition program tells you how successful they all are. But the true statistics, as usually kept by the Inland Revenue or tax offices in various countries where people claim tax deductions, tells you that a smaller proportion of the population is claiming those deductions than ever before. But philanthropy still goes up. It goes up because some people are giving a lot more than previously. So on average, the higher value donors are giving more. And so, as has been said many times, the 80-20 rules become really the 95-5 rule in a sense, and the ability of a few people to very much change results for an institution or even for a whole country is significant. We're also seeing, and especially during the last 8 months, that some first-time gifts to institutions are very large. The idea that people work their way up through some kind of donor pyramid was probably never quite intended to be used that way, and has often been misstated, and certainly is out of kilter with what many are finding, is that people of means and some who've become reached a philanthropic stage of life have real burning issues that they want to address, and will pick the institution they think best address it. Usually still local. People still don't make first gifts very far away from home, so it's probably still local, but they come in at a large level. And as I say, usually to address a complex problem that they already care about. In watching foundations, it's quite interesting because there are 2 very distinct attitudes foundations have taken. And in this, I'm thinking about those foundations that are allowed to give internationally and that have a track record of doing so. Some, during times of concern and crisis at home, have retreated from their global work and started to give a greater proportion of their funds locally to address domestic concerns. But those, particularly those who've been giving internationally for 20 or 30 years or more, have decided to stick with strong international programs and stay committed to the international work, particularly in the light of how the long-term effects of COVID-19 are going to impact on those parts of the world least able to respond and be self-sufficient. So I think, so for both individuals and charitable trusts and foundations, we need to watch those large trends and be in communication with them. It's okay to contact one of your donors or a foundation and ask what their current attitude is. You don't have to double guess it and just change your gift request. Get in and ask how they're responding. I think they'll appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, it's great information. And if you think about the sort of the takeaway from some of the things you're sharing, Daniel, it's number one, it involves making sure that that academic institutions, educational institutions are really looking at their best problem-solving research, the kinds of things that they're doing that are really moving the needle, solving problems that will have long-term effects, both, you know, it could be national, but regional, national, it could be international. And don't be afraid of putting cases together and talking with, if you do get in front of high value prospects globally about whether you've had engaged them or not, about some of the sort of the most impactful things you're working on now, because this is the time to do it in a lot of ways, because of some of the data that's coming out regarding high net worth individuals who are really looking carefully at what institutions, whether they're academic or not, can really help them achieve their philanthropic goals as donors. On to consideration number 7, which both Daniel and I really think is one of the most critical things to consider during this year, which is how do you maintain a sense of optimism or confidence during these challenging times? With all the issues we're confronting today in 2020 and moving into 2021, there could be serious barriers for us to have a sense of confidence and optimism for fundraising across borders. Some of the data that we both shared might make you question or concerned about what the future might entail. But with all of that said, I think there's some important things to remember at this time. Number one, globally, there's always a demand for education around the world, and alumni live throughout the globe. More than likely, your alumni move across borders. The globe has gotten flatter in that way. And academic institutions do more than prepare just students for a career. They train the next generation of leaders globally to confront the greatest challenges. And if you do have alumni really focusing on some of the helping to solve some of these big problems, they are a perfect person to stay engaged with for a whole slew of reasons. More than that, universities and colleges, and even K through 12 to some degree, have some of the greatest problem solvers as part of their communities, scientists and others. And in many ways, they're prepared to make the greatest impact with their work, with greater philanthropy. And Dresner once said that, and I think it's true, that if recessions and depressions come in some ways and economic declines, typically we've noticed, certainly 2008 was a good indication of this, that the impact of the recession on giving to education is not as strong or as consistent as overall giving. We've noticed that around the world. So the final consideration today, the 8th, is it is crucial at this time to focus on what we know about fundraising, even though so much is changing around us. It's critical not to forget that successfully cultivating a diverse international donor pool that we are all responsible for requires many specific time-tested and proven development methods that apply to fundraising programs, whether it's small or large. Yes, some new awareness and finesse is needed, and we tried to bring some of those up today. Institutions and their leaders must meet donors where they're at right now, and both geographically and culturally. And it's really important to as Daniel mentioned earlier, make sure you're paying attention to what's the situation today in the pandemic, how it's affecting them. Because I think that that's both real and honest and authentic in that way. And remember that international fundraising doesn't need to be that complex. I mean, it requires significant investment of time and money to achieve sort of the literacy necessary for true donor-centered fundraising, but don't overthink it. And don't be culturally sensitive. Prepare for whatever part of the world in which you might travel in the future, and do virtual as well, because right now it doesn't look like we're going to be traveling too soon. And certainly treat potential supporters the same way you would treat a domestic prospect or supporter. You want to identify and listen and engage and understand that it is going to take some time to do it. So Daniel, when we started today, you posed 3 really important questions, and I wondered if you could revisit those now and see if we were able to achieve any wisdom from those.
Thanks, Stuart. The first question was, has anything about the fundraising fundamentals changed? And now the principles that were sound, still sound. Here we are at the end of 2020 and going into 2021. And I think there's been no reason to change the fundamentals, but great reason to reinforce them. They're playing out in different ways because we're using different channels of communication. But the emphasis on relationships, understanding the donor perspective, donor care and stewardship, careful reporting on the impact of contributions, all these things have been emphasized for the last 5 to 10 years, still are very sound. But if you've been in an office that's been distracted by constant acquisition, distracted by bright and shiny new things, someone's pet hobby, become over-reliant on events and gatherings and event-style fundraising and auctions, etc., then you will have discovered that these things are less secure for your future. So there's no reason to change the fundamentals, but there is good reason to ensure that they're working in the communication channels that you currently have available. Our second question was, what changes are necessary to get the best results during the rest of the COVID-19 period? And I think in a moment, Stuart, you're going to summarize the action points from today, and that will answer that question. The third question was, can we use the learnings from COVID-19 to improve fundraising in the long term? And what I think you can, and I gave the example of International Council of Advisors, and I think that you should think about what stays and how you can jump beyond this to find new ways for your volunteers. If you think of your institution as the holder of a taxi cab license, this is your Uber moment. This is your chance for fundamental realignment of the business, because it's not coming back the same as it was before. So this isn't a case just for waiting it out. I think we'll find people's behavior is different. There are lots of people now claiming to be introverts and saying, well, this really suits me. People have become comfortable. A piece appeared in the National Australian newspaper a couple of weekends ago. One of the women journalists was writing that she'd had a nightmare, and the nightmare was that the government sent the army house to house and told everyone to get their proper shoes on and get back to work. So but it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen that it just goes back to where we were before. There are people who've discovered they can work really well from home. Hopefully university presidents have discovered that they can engage people around the world without 2 days of travel time. And so they're more willing to do international fundraising and international alumni relations than ever before. And part of the job of many people in advancement is to make that happen. So this is your Uber moment. I hope you can find your Uber opportunities.
Thanks, Daniel. So let's finish off just by reiterating the action points that we shared throughout our talk. The one is first, certainly review your cases for support, ensure they address the concerns that are important to prospects right now. We also shared ensure your activities, including all online activities, are culturally appropriate by rehearsing and critiquing them and getting them really spot on. The third was have individual engagement plans for all of your major donors and major prospects, and make sure you have effective, segmented communications with all donors and prospects. Segmented meaning really focused in on what would be best for them. 4, be ready for online participation to stay around, like Daniel said, and be open to increasing involvement of international volunteers, either a council, like Daniel mentioned, or other types of vehicles or other types of structures. Now that travel has really been eliminated as a requirement of participation. The next is make sure to prepare leadership well in advance for online prospect and donor engagements. The key is to make the virtual experiences authentic and honest, and interesting and uplifting. Authentic is really key. The next is observe the changes of what's happening globally in philanthropy and be ready to seek funds for your best and most compelling problem-solving research or activities or outreach. It might shift from what your cases were before, and that's okay too. Daniel and I would like to express our appreciation to you for joining us today. We wish everybody a year of progress, health and safety as well, health and safety from all of us for all your international fundraising efforts. And we look forward to staying engaged with you as IFAB continues in the years ahead.
Thanks, Stuart. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.